Hello Summoners and welcome back to another ProGuides patch rundown. My name is Christoph and today I'll be going over all the changes that were made in patch 9.6. I'll cover all the details including a tier list for each role that was made by our in-house analysts and partnered pro players. Since the patch has just hit the live servers, please do keep in mind that these tier lists are purely predictions. We encourage all of our viewers to comment on our tier lists and say if you agree or disagree with us on certain champion placements. Also, as a reminder, there will be a second tier list video available next week where we use fresh statistics to give you guys the most accurate tier lists available. This is a big patch and there's a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. Kael's win rate has been gradually increasing since the start of her rework. At first, she seemed like a C-tier champion, but now she's looking quite strong, especially as more players learn how to play her. As a result, Kael will be receiving a series of buffs and nerfs this patch, starting with her base stats. Her attack damage and attack speed growth per level will be lowered, and her default adaptive damage is now changed to AD instead of AP. Secondly, her W will have its movement speed nerfed by a small amount, but the delay on its effects will be removed completely. Lastly, Kael's E will no longer have a cast time to allow her kit to feel a little less clunky. Kael will be moved up to our A tier in our top lane tier list and will be a great pickup this patch. Before Orin's mini rework, Orin was mostly just a lane bully. However, in the current meta, he's somewhat of the opposite of that due to his weak early game, yet powerful late game. Given that you can't even reach the late game if you get dumpstered on during the early game, Orin will be receiving a few buffs to make him feel a little bit more satisfying in his matches. Firstly, there will be a few quality of life changes on his passive and item upgrades in the shop. Secondly, his Q will no longer expire if Orin casts his E near the end of the pillar duration. Lastly, Orin's W, Bellows Breath, will have its cooldown reduced by a small amount. Orin will be moved up to our B tier this patch. The Crabman was gutted a few patches ago and his win rate has dropped drastically ever since. Although he's a weak pick for solo queue, this clearly isn't the case for competitive matches. Urgot is still seeing tons of play in pro scenes such as the LCK and LEC. But to help Urgot become a viable top laner in solo queue again, he'll be receiving a ton of changes this patch. To start things off, his base mana and mana regen growth will be buffed significantly. Next, his passive, Echoing Flames, will be removed, and also the shield on his W will be moved to his E. Purge will also be getting a buff on its mana cost and cooldown, and the on-hit damage reduction will be lowered by 16%. Disdain will also be receiving a small nerf to its mana cost during later stages of the game, but will have its cooldown buffed by a small amount. Lastly, Urgot's ultimate, Fear Beyond Death, will have its second proc range increased followed by a buff to its damage. Urgot will be moved up to our A tier for top laners this patch, but we'll see if he can actually make the push to S tier in our mid-patch video next week. Although Gnar has been getting small buffs in the past few patches, he still hasn't had much improvement in solo queue. Gnar's W will have its cooldown reduced significantly in his Mega Gnar form. Gnar will be moved up to our B tier top laners for patch 9.6. Jace has recently made the push to S tier due to a lot of the meta champions having losing matchups into Jace. It feels like he's just a bit too oppressive in lane right now, so he'll be receiving a few nerfs this patch. Jace's base health, health growth, health regen, and health regen per level will be nerfed this patch. He will be dropped into our A tier for top laners, and we'll see next week if he stays there. Shen has disappeared from the top lane meta for a while now and has been mainly played as a support. To give Shen some power to battle it out in the top lane, his Q, Twilight Shroud, will have its on-hit damage buffed by a significant amount. Shen will be moved up to our B tier top laners, but might take the push to A tier next week. The top lane tier list for this patch will have a ton of changes made from our last one in patch 9.5. Starting with our S tier, we welcome a new member, Kennen. Although he's relatively unpopular in the lower ranks, our partnered pro players have all mentioned Kennen to be a sleeper OP right now in the top lane. We highly recommend you try him out. He's an aggressive lane bully with a game-changing ultimate. Kael and Urgot have been moved up to our A tier, and Gnar, Shen, and Ryze have been moved up to our B tier. Although Ryze is an S tier pick in competitive play, he's still only B tier at best for solo queue. Our analysts recommend you pick up Urgot for this patch. The mini rework done to his kit will have a huge impact on his stance in the meta, and you might actually see him in our S tier for our mid-patch analysis video next week. And if you guys want to get notified on when our next video comes out, please click subscribe and then click the bell. Hecarim has been a great pick for solo queue recently, and a lot of high elo junglers are adding him to their champion pool. However, in lower ranks, Hecarim just doesn't have the same impact as he does in higher ones. Hecarim will be receiving a buff to his Q, which now does 10% additional damage per stack. Hecarim will remain in our jungle A tier, but is one of the best contenders to make the push to S tier next week. Ivern has been making a huge comeback since last season and has surprised everyone with his increasing win rate. Having low XP efficiency in the jungle has allowed Ivern to actually thrive in the meta. Ivern will have a small change this patch to his W, which now more quickly empowers his auto attacks when he enters the bush. He will remain in our jungle A tier for patch 9.6. RekSai has had a lot of reliability added to her kit in patch 9.4, which resulted in her becoming the best solo queue jungler in the game. To lower her oppressiveness in the meta, RekSai will be receiving a nerf to her ultimate, Void Rush, which will have its cooldown and AD ratio nerfed by a small amount. RekSai will remain in our jungle S tier for this patch due to her early to mid-game burst being almost untouched. Trundle used to be the king of the jungle but has seen less play due to some heavy nerfs to his kit. To help Trundle come back into the jungle, his W, Frozen Domain, will now offer more attack speed while in the area. Trundle will remain in our B tier junglers for patch 9.6. Although there were a few balance changes made to champions in our jungle tier list, the overall tier list will remain very similar to the last patch. In our S tier, we welcome a new member, Udyr. Udyr is really strong right now and is definitely one of the most underrated picks. His level 2 power spike is unbeatable and he can 1v1 any jungler at the first Scuttle Crab. Camille has been slightly returning to the meta and she will be added back into our C tier junglers this patch. For patch 9.6, our analysts recommend you pick up Vi and Hecarim. These two junglers are really strong right now and will bring you great results if you invest just a little bit of time into them. They are fairly easy to play, so you can even jump into a ranked game with them after 2 to 3 normal matches. On-hit Nico was one of the strongest picks last patch in almost every role. Lucky for us, it was hotfixed and the on-hit style was nerfed heavily. To compensate for such a hard nerf during the mid-patch, Nico will be receiving a small buff to her attack speed per level. Nico will remain in our mid lane A tier for patch 9.6 due to these buffs not really having a significant impact on her. LeBlanc has been one of the strongest mid laners in the game for quite some time now. Even after multiple nerfs, she's still sitting at our S tier for months now. LeBlanc will be receiving a nerf on her Q, which will have its AP ratio lowered to 0.3 AP. LeBlanc will be dropped to our A tier mid laners for this patch due to Minion D Materializer also receiving a big nerf. We'll go over the changes made to D Materializer later on in this video, so make sure you watch until the very end. Silas is by far the strongest mid lane champion in the game right now, and he's been dominating the current meta. His ability to brush off any harass with his W has been far too strong, and he'll be receiving a few nerfs on that ability this patch. The heal ratio on Kingslayer will be lowered by 0.05, and the empowered heal will be nerfed by 25%. Silas will remain in our S tier for mid laners this patch. Zoe has been slowly returning to the meta recently, and it's been extremely frustrating to play against her. To allow other champions to punish Zoe a little bit harder, her E will have its cooldown nerfed, followed by a nerf to its slow percentage. Zoe will remain in our mid lane A tier this patch. The mid lane tier list for patch 9.6 sees a few changes compared to our last one. We've moved Lissandra back up to our S tier due to her win rate slowly increasing, and LeBlanc has been dropped down to our A tier. Ryze and Azir have been dropped to our C tier due to their win rates being some of the lowest in the game right now. It might also come as a surprise to you to see Kael in our C tier while being in our top lane A tier. This is mainly due to mid lane being so focused on the early game wave clear and helping your jungler at Scuttle Crabs. Playing Kael mid means you automatically lose lane priority, resulting in your jungler losing the early game. In addition to that, Kael has much better matchups in the top lane compared to the mid lane. For patch 9.6, our analysts recommend you pick up Talia in the mid lane. Her win rate has been going up every single patch, and she's definitely being played a lot more. Notable high elo mid laners such as Bjergsen, Froggen, and Quantum Physics have been spamming her in solo queue right now, and they've had some great results. Caitlyn has had a decent stance in the bottom lane meta, but needed a bit more love to make the push to S tier. Caitlyn will have her ultimate's damage increased by 50 at all ranks. Although this is a decent buff, she'll still remain in our ADC A tier for patch 9.6, but we'll see what happens next week when the data comes out. Xayah has been struggling to keep up with the other AD carries ever since the item reworks unless she was laning with her partner, Rakan. To help Xayah come back into the meta as an independent pick, her W will have its bonus attack speed buffed significantly at all ranks. Xayah will be moved up to our ADC A tier for this patch. Now let's talk about Brawler's Glove. Brawler's Glove's critical strike will no longer be classified as a unique passive. And I guess all we have to say for this is, happy stacking. Now let's go into Overheal. Overheal is currently a must-pick rune with pros and high elo ADC mains. In order to bring more flexibility to the precision rune tree, Overheal will actually be nerfed by a decent amount. We'll see how this affects all the ADCs next week. At the start of patch 9.5, we were promised nerfs to Ezreal ADC, and here they are. Instead of nerfing Ezreal directly, the balance team have decided to target his double tier build instead. If you own Manamune or Archangels, you are no longer allowed to purchase another tier. Although this is a big nerf, our analysts believe that Ezreal will still remain an S-tier ADC. The ADC tier list remains almost the same as the last one, with the exception of Xayah in our A tier. In our S tier, we have Lucian, Jinx, Sivir, Ezreal, and Vayne. Although Ezreal was nerfed pretty heavily, we'll see if he drops down into our A tier next week. For patch 9.6, our analysts recommend you pick up Vayne in the bottom lane. Although she's a very hard champion to play, she's currently one of the strongest of all of our S-tier champions due to Ezreal receiving some nerfs. We don't recommend you jump into ranked right away with her, so make sure you get lots of practice in normal games beforehand. Nautilus has been struggling in the current meta for quite some time, but he's definitely receiving a few buffs this patch to help him out. Nautilus's base armor will be increased by 3.5 and his passive, Staggering Blow, will have its cooldown lowered by a significant amount. Nautilus will be moved up to our B-tier support for patch 9.6. He might actually make a comeback in the top lane and jungle too this patch, so make sure you're prepared for that as well. Our support tier list for patch 9.6 remains very similar to the last one we had previously. In S tier, we have Nico, Morgana, Thresh, Soraka, and Nami. These 5 champions are a tier above the rest and will give you the best competitive edge you need against your opponents. There was only one support balance change this patch, so it's not expected that our support tier list would change drastically. Also, we forgot to add in Zyra and Brand in the last video, so we've made sure to correct our mistakes this time. For patch 9.6, our analysts recommend you pick up Blitzcrank. He's a game-changing support and is often banned in lower elo due to his frustrating playstyle. It doesn't matter if you miss 99% of your hooks in the early game as long as you land that one game-winning hook during the late game. Try him out and let us know how that goes below. Now let's talk about Minion D Materializer. With a meta that's focused around mid-lane priority, Minion D Materializer has been a staple rune for most mid-lane champions. In order to bring more flexibility in rune selection, Minion D Materializer will have a few changes made to it this patch. Firstly, its charges will be lowered from 6 to 3. To compensate for this nerf, its base damage bonus, additional damage bonus, and starting cooldown will be buffed. Minion and monster gold bounties are receiving a few changes this patch as well. Firstly, they will accrue more slowly and decrease if you lose your advantage. Secondly, minion and monster bounties are getting toned down by a decent amount as well. We should also talk about Ranked Reset. The request from the League community has finally been heard by Riot and they've decided to reset Ranked. If you're Diamond 4 or above, your rank will have a soft reset this patch. Every tier from D4 to D1 will be dropped by 1 division, flooring at Diamond 4. If you are Masters Plus, then your rank will be reset down to Masters 0 LP at the start of the patch. That's it for our patch 9.6 rundown video. If you guys enjoyed watching this video, then please leave a like, comment, and subscribe to our channel to be notified for our next video. Make sure to check out our website for free content and guides that were made by our favorite pro players. The second part of our meta-analysis video will be available next week, so make sure to hit that sub button and that bell. Our next video will give you guys so much more accurate tier lists using the fresh statistics that came out for this week. Thanks for watching, guys. Good luck in your next games, and I'll see you on the Rift.